Good morning and welcome back. I am James Marcuzzo. It is week 2 in the KSS, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Haidt and Lukianoff article, why it's a bad idea to tell students words are violence. So they open up with a discussion of some research by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She says a couple things they agree with, but she makes some very inaccurate, very bad inferences from those positions. So firstly, we do know, well established, long-term consistent stress causes physical harm. People that are homeless, people that live in war zones, that are constantly under that kind of stress do have negative physical manifestations. No problem. Also, humans are anti-fragile, which means that bouts of stress, bouts of challenge and conflict make us stronger. And that's both in a physical as well as an emotional situation. So you can think exercising and working out makes you physically stronger. Getting sick, but then getting better and building antibodies and developing antibodies makes you physically stronger. But emotionally, that's true as well. You know, children go through the rigors of growing up to build up their toolbox of how to deal with conflict resolution. Right? Hopefully that's pretty clear. So we get better, we get stronger when stresses are put upon us. But there's, of course, a breaking point, overly dramatic physical damage, like a car accident, or, traumatic stress, being assaulted, rape, people coming out of war zones and having really, really serious, emotional issues that can be triggered by things around them, right? So we're not talking about that. Okay, so then they agree with those things, but what they disagree with strongly is some of the inferences that she makes. First, she says that because stress can cause physical harm, and physical harm is a form of violence, then words that cause stress can be a form of violence. That's very, very inaccurate. I'm paraphrasing. But here's the problem. She's conflating a couple different things. She's conflating short-term stress and long-term stress. That breaks the causal chain immediately. That's very, very inaccurate. Logically, very inconsistent. Short-term stress does not cause physical harm. It does not. There is no evidence of that. Secondly, she talks about harm versus violence. Violence is very much, there's elements of malice, of intent, and harm can be, if a tree falls on your foot, a tree branch, there's no violence there, but it is harm. But it was completely accidental. There was no intent. So they disagree with those positions strongly, and because of that inaccuracy in her assessment that words are violence, and therefore we can stop speakers from coming to college campuses that promote ideas that students may find offensive. Right? That is a terrible, terrible idea. They hate this. I hate this. It is the last thing that a university should be promoting. Moving on, they talk about some of the most progressive, liberal, open, inclusive, diverse campuses campuses in the United States. Middlebury, Evergreen State, and Evergreen State is an interesting story. You ought to go look that up if you have any interest in this stuff. It was like a Maoist era, cultural revolution type of thing that took place there several years back. On these campuses, and there's several other Ivy League campuses fit the bill as well, they talk about really, really bad logical inaccuracies. Numerical disparities are proof of systemic discrimination. A clumsy or insensitive question is an act of aggression, like a microaggression. The words are sometimes acts of violence that will shorten your life. None of these things are true. Disparities may not be because of discrimination. It could be, but they're not automatically. That's just logically inconsistent. And so these universities are sort of teaching this culture of safety. And by safety, they mean they have to feel safe all the time, which is not realistic. But it teaches students to engage in some of the same cognitive distortions that cognitive behavioral therapy tries to eliminate. Emotional reasoning, catastrophizing, and dichotomous thinking. So, in some of the most progressive, open, diverse, inclusive places in the country and in the world, American college campuses, these students feel like they're physically under existential threat for their lives. Makes no sense. It's not true at all. And yet they're being told that. And I'll just give you a little, they don't talk about it in here, but they would eventually once their research led them down this road. It's critical theory. When you teach critical theory to people, you scramble their brains and you give them a very inaccurate perspective on reality that is very destructive. Not to mention, this particular age group, born in the early 90s, has higher rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and even higher rates of suicide as compared to other previous generations. There is some assumed factors that calculate into this, and Haidt talks about this in other research. Social media is a big factor. Social media has a really negative impact on people's mental health. Helicopter parenting and children being unable to develop their own skills for conflict resolution. So, getting in fights once in a while and learning how to avoid those things instead of always having parents around to settle the disputes. So I think that really is a pretty good explanation of what they're talking about. This is all fundamentally anti-free speech. And I think that's just a terrible, terrible thing. And so do they. They think that as well. And a terrible thing to be happening on college campuses of all places. So this will tie in nicely, I think, with the Stanley Fish article on free speech that we'll talk about shortly. Good luck, and contact me with any questions.